I say, why this mid 21st century need to do this, right? Many reasons, but one is that the reader needs someone to symbolically fight white right-wing American Christian nationalists who, as we have seen until they started to go to jail, have been willing to physically confront their enemies. The well-funded right has ex and future president Donald Trump on down. Fox News, which is now the right's most conservative and professional news outlet, right? Former generals such as Michael Flynn, state house people doing all this crazy stuff, think tanks, local organizations, da 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 da. And we on the left only have Reverend Barber, Angela Davis, and some elite college professors, and I mentioned them: Claude, West, Kelly, Taylor, Yamada Taylor. We have some filmmakers and journalists, but all who have made sure they scare absolutely no one. Except that one time when Marco Montiel, when he almost got fired, attacking Israel at the United Nations, right? The ironic thing is that if we're honest about King, this is what King wanted to be. King wanted to be Eddie Glaude. King wanted to be Cornel West, right? Ironically,
no,
we got to be honest about that. We've got to be honest about that. All King said his entire life, all he said his entire life was he wanted a few years as a pastor, and then he wanted to go be president of Morehouse. If King had had his way, we'd have never heard of him, because that's all he wanted to do.
Oh, you're talking about at the beginning. You're talking about at the beginning.
But when you read all the books, but see, I've read all the books. Even when he's alcoholic and he's depressed, near suicidal, he still talks about, all I ever wanted to be was a college professor.
All I ever wanted to be back then. Now I realize I want more and can't be that and can't settle for that, which is why he yells at Andy Young, I'm a revolutionary. You're a capitalist. I'm not. I want a revolution. You don't. Come on now, Todd. Come on, man. You can't. King at the beginning.
No, I'm talking about King at the end. I've read all the books. I'm talking about King at the end. King at the end.
I've read one or two, but he says, but what you just said is
at the end was an American until he died. He was an American. He may have been. Now there's an argument, and you were in a panel. You're in an excellent panel with Marco Montiel over the argument whether he was a democratic socialist or a social democrat, right? And that was an excellent discussion. But King at the end was an American. He talked about to the end, he talked about the American dream.
Todd, he did not. He talked about it being a nightmare. Todd, he talked about capitalism. He's already to the left of almost every name you mentioned by the fact that he was not programmatically willing to go along with, beyond the critiques that are similar with Robin Kelly, West, Taylor. He was not willing to support the Democratic Party. He was wanting to engage in programmatic activism, direct nonviolent direct action, in which rents were redistributed, permanent encampments of protesters were left. Again, this is not again, that is decidedly not what those who you are saying are his political kinmates. That they are my point is, what they do more than anything is falsely claim that heir to be the heir to that.
I agree with that.
Or are falsely presented by others as the heir. They're not the same, though. You're saying that they're the same, and that all King wanted was to be Yamada Taylor and Robin Kelly. That is demonstrably false, though.
I'm saying that King would have been happy being in that role and not being an activist. That was true in the
beginning. In 1950.
That was true in the beginning, and in the end, he felt obligated to complete that at the end.
But wait a minute. But George Jackson even said, "All I want to do is be here to love and gratify the body."
Sure.
But my recognition, my political analysis now moves me to something else. Sure. I'm saying, I'm even on a much lower level saying the same thing. I don't even want to take the analysis I have.
Sure.
I don't want the punishment I've suffered, just at a way reduced level. I don't even want that.
Sure.
But it's irrelevant to what I think is necessary now. King is very clear about that. And I don't understand. I think that distinction has to be made clear.
And I'm glad you're making it, but I'm just pointing out that the inner yearnings of the man contradicts what he felt he had to do. Because I agree with you. Because look, I teach Martin Luther King Scholars at Seton Hall. I don't use any of these books. You know what I use? I use the one book that all the radicals like and that they should like, which is what? Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community?
And let's talk about how that book was talked about in here real quick.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because it wasn't. Which is more evidence of the fraudulence of this book.
Sure.
And I have, oh man, I can't, of course, I'm gonna find the note. The point is the book is really only mentioned to talk about the criticism it got, not to talk about what its actual arguments were. This is part of the slick hustle that has become this brand. It's right here. It's right. Well, go ahead. But I
just want to point out very quickly. This is the point that you will like. I want to point out that, people forget that the night before he died, he was calling for a boycott of Coca-Cola and Seal Test milk. So it's important to mention that
supporting striking sanitation workers again.
So he begins and
everybody you mentioned.
Okay, so he begins and ends his official political life with economic boycotts. And I think it's important to say that because that's never said.
Wait a minute. No, see, this is part of my wait. No.
Go ahead.
No. The framing of that is entirely wrong.
Go ahead.
And this is the point of why where do we go from here not being discussed in this book is part of the fraudulence of the writing of the narrative. Because in that book he's very clear, boycotts don't work. Buying power doesn't work. What is required is an actual revolution where the state gets involved in planning the redistribution of the wealth this society creates. He's very clear.
He may have said that in the book, but the night before he died, that speech that ends with "I've been to the mountaintop," he calls for a boycott of Coca-Cola.
Of course, he's not saying again. But my point is, to divorce the tactic from the overall philosophy is the problem.
Okay,
because what ends up happening in the 21st century is that people say, "Oh, well, all we have to do is just boycott. We should just boycott." And what King is saying is no, and that's why they keep even today going back to the Montgomery boycott. People will come back to this book and rebrand what in terms of what you just said, what King was doing the night before he was killed.
Okay.
To say that he was an advocate of boycotts as the final solution. Maybe that's a bad choice of phrasing there, but his, as an ultimate solution.
Right. Yeah, that's better. Right.
My bad.
I think that's a little better. Right.
But maybe it's because I looked up the ownership of the publisher of this book, and it does go back to Germany. Maybe that's what's in the back of my mind. But the Holzberg Group or whatever, it's Germans. It's the Germans. But my point is, tactically, of course, he was there, and Eeg even talks about in this book how he was invited to Memphis. How he was he's going. Again, any of us would do the same thing. All of us do the same thing. We all support tactics or actions that we're not thinking are the ultimate end all be all. But the people are good people. We're invited. We go do it. So of course, King is going to go down there and say, "I support the striking workers here. I support a boycott against this there." But when it came to producing a written analysis that would be his final written document, he's very clear. These things don't work.
Okay.
We can't. Okay. So that's why what I'm saying that Eeg is doing, and why I'm disagreeing with you here, is that framing, it leaves it as, oh yeah, we just need to start. We just need to do a little boycott here today. Or we can buy black, or we can bank black, or all the things that he specifically says, and where do we go from here? That are not sufficient. So then when Eeg comes back and says, where do we go from here? Yeah, he wrote the book. I'm acknowledging he wrote the book. Sure. What did he say in the book? It's irrelevant. Let's talk about the criticism he gets from the book. How the New York Times and them criticize, and Andrew Kopkind and them criticize the book. Let's talk about that. and how King lost relevance and this and that. And again, not telling us why was he losing relevance, because he was too radical for them, which is why today West, to the extent he's relevant, the other names you mentioned, to the extent they're relevant because they're not doing what King's doing. They're not advocating. None of them have overtly advocated going left of the Democratic Party. None of them have advocated redistributing, to collecting rents, going to the hood. We're going to organize a movement to go to the hood and neither have I. Fair. I'm just none of us have said, let's put 3,000 plus people on the monument in the mall every day, and we're going to rotate them out until the machinery of this country fails to operate anymore. That's what King was doing. That's why the Washington Post said 90 days before he's killed, this dude is a threat. Right. And that's why Ig has to come back and say, oh, no, he's a founding father. Get all the out of here. People are lucky my kids are home. God damn it.
We don't have any passion about Martin Luther King, audience. You know, we're very indifferent about Martin.
And it's not, to be fair, it's not just about King. My point is it's when the ideas that make me, that honestly bring tears to my eyes. To be real, I get teary-eyed when I think about, and I think they're crocodile tears, because that's what, crocodiles tear up when they're about to eat you. That's where that comes from. But I get teary-eyed when I think about these ideas and these movements, man. I do feel it. I do. And when I see what these motherfuckers are doing, it is so, and it's so conscious.
And to give you an idea, audience, what Dr. Ball is talking about, Ing has all sorts of space for all the Jesus moments, right? When King's on stage and a white guy literally gets off of his seat, goes up on stage and slugs him, right? And King says, don't press charges, like he has time for that, right? Ing has time, and all the books talk about this, when he's signing into a hotel room and a white guy goes, are you Martin Luther King? He goes, yes, and he slugs him, right? He has all the space for that. He has all the space for him calling his girlfriends, but none of the space for talking about the World House, right? Is that a good summation of your argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect way of putting it, because, when you look, and it's the same thing that is done to people. That's why my one-liner had become, Dr. King is the most known and least understood figure in human history, second maybe only to the historical Jesus Christ. That's a good one. Because one, I don't think Jesus existed maybe at all at this point. The more research comes out, I'm not even sure he ever existed. But to the extent that he did, and the way he did, he's been completely rebranded.
Sure.
And any radicalism that existed in that story has been reduced. And that's what happens to King. So socialist or socialism is never really mentioned unless connected to democratic socialist. Communism is only mentioned in regard to Hoover's concern over King and communism in general, and reading reports that communism isn't affecting the civil rights movement, and Hoover gets upset. Who gives a fuck that Hoover gets upset unless you explain why he's upset? Why is he upset? Because this wonderful Disneyland of a country that you're writing about is a capitalist, imperial, colonial monster. And and that's what King was trying to deal with. And you don't want, and he's clear he's trying to deal with it as such. And you don't want to,
because
he's a Du Boisian. Did they even talk about Du Bois at all in this book?
Du Bois, who's that? I mean, look, the bottom line is Jesus is.
And when they do Du Bois a life, no. When they do Assata Shakur a life,
right.
That's when we're going to have to raise Jared's bail money on BPM. Because something is gonna something. No, I'm just playing.
I made it for him because of age, right? I said Jesus. I meant Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King in this book is Black Jesus who redeems America,
which is an oxymoron, because Jesus was, of course, black if he was around. And what I love to what they're building towards is, as we'll see, is this idea that a lot of us are quick to say you can't have theory without practice. But we don't consider the opposite, or the balance, that without theory, practice is insufficient. And as they argue here, as I interpret what they argue here, practice without theory is hopeless. But we'll see. But I just love how especially after coming back to reread it once again, I can see the building toward that end. Throughout the chapter, we draw on the 1968 iteration of King's Other America speech in order to broach and work through several themes relevant to our discussion. as pastor and public intellectual, as a figure who traveled widely and delivered sermons and speeches over and over. King often worked from set pieces. He often repeated himself, and he often improvised on common themes. The Other America was initially a talk at Stanford University in April 1967. Its title phrase clearly a play on Michael Harrington's monumental 1962 book on American poverty. By March of 1968, when King delivered an alternative version to predominantly black labor to a predominantly black labor audience in New York, the phrase would have been resoundingly consistent with the findings of the Kerner Commission, which famously concluded that the nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. King's speech to the 199ers or 1199ers often offers but one window to his thinking about poverty, labor, cross-racial political solidarity, and the Poor People's Campaign, which he had announced in December of 1967, among other themes. It also reveals a later King curiously ambivalent about violent protest or at least the destruction of property. In other words, correct me if I'm wrong, the text is in front of you, but you can certainly get the full book to read for yourself. But when King was speaking to a black audience, he had a very different, not a very different, but a nuanced, a different emphasis than when he had one, as they talk about, delivered in conversation with working people, rather than at the Stanford crowd. That helps us, as they say, to grapple most generatively with the methodological question. In the face of deep inequality and inequity, in the face of racial worlds that appear all too separate and unequal, how did King and how do we orient and sustain the critical imagination? I think that's an important point, as King is often misrepresented politically and symbolically, and even by black capitalists routinely, as someone who supports black business and black capitalism as a solution and so on and so forth. King not only did not do that, but King, as they say here, went so far as to say that he was curiously ambivalent about violent protest, or at least the destruction of property. And what this is essentially is presentation that a sort of a summary of a presentation that I've been doing for a number of years on the way Dr. King was dealt with in the press as more of a sign of the way he would ultimately be dealt with physically, and then has been dealt with posthumously in image and branding, or that is rebranding. So what I've done here is just, I know that what I'm going to describe here in the context of the Washington Post has been done in a variety and across multimedia. I think it's a good summary of, how mainstream and commercial press have dealt with him, and in like a lot of commercial media and punditry as well. So as I talk about here, I'm not sure what this is doing here. Let me get rid of that. That's not necessary. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think this is the date where this picture took place, where the one time these two met, and I can be checked on that. The purpose of this image, in terms of the context of this presentation, is to show that while often Dr. King and Malcolm X are meant to be seen as polar opposites or juxtaposed against one another, certainly in popular imagination, it wasn't only that the two were eventually planning to come together and working together. They had, through intermediaries and discussion, joining forces, etc. But it wasn't so much that Malcolm was, quote unquote, softening to the politics of Dr. King. It was more that Dr. King was radicalizing to the politics of a Malcolm X. And so it is, on the one hand, natural and logical that they would have been coming together, and then of course natural and logical that they would have been dealt with in much similar fashion by the state, and by the way, posthumously in images. Both have been wildly rebranded, almost in ways that are meant to not reflect who they were in real life, or more importantly, I think, the politics that they were working with. Again, just in terms of context, we start here with the FBI's counterintelligence program, which of course was targeting all forms of so-called radicalism and leftist activity. And as it directed itself towards the Black liberation struggle, it said here, quote, that its goal was to prevent the rise of a Black messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. This was written in 1966, so he was already assassinated. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrine, nonviolence, and embrace Black nationalism, end quote. So on the one hand, it's important to note the names here. We'll come back to that. Malcolm X, of course, Dr. King, the central figure for this presentation, Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. By the way, in amazingly some of the more popular and well-funded and positioned and promoted scholarship on Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, the counterintelligence program is not even mentioned, nor is his own autobiography mentioned in what is supposed to be or purports to be a biography of the man. So we can maybe talk about that another time. And Elijah Muhammad or the Nation of Islam are all mentioned here. And then, of course, a very direct and explicit statement that King would be considered, quote unquote, a very real contender for the threatening position of a Black messiah should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrine. So the FBI is at least explicit here in saying what is and is not acceptable as Black leadership, and what is or is not acceptable or seen as threatening in terms of the form of that leadership. And then a lesser known fact here that I highlight here in terms of quotation from William C. Sullivan, the head of the FBI's Division 5, working, of course, under J. Edgar Hoover in the development of the counterintelligence program and all manner of scandalous and scurrilous behavior, said immediately after Dr. King's what's supposed to be his more soft and acceptable "I have a dream" speech, already, as you see here, Sullivan has him being targeted and saying, we must mark him now, quote, if that is, quote, we must mark him now if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. So already he's been targeted as a national security threat. Already Dr. King has been targeted by those at the highest levels of state and intelligence agency operation as someone who is a threat to national security and a threat to become to replace the vacated seat of by the martyred Malcolm X as the Black Messiah who would lead Black people in the United States towards Black nationalism and away from white liberal doctrines of nonviolence. Now, that doesn't mean that he was immediately seen or depicted or not maybe given a chance to walk away from that threatening position, because as I'm just showing here, and we can sort of mark his descent, so to speak, in the eyes of the state, where not long after the assassination, a year after the assassination of Malcolm X in January of 1966, the Washington Post is noting that Dr. King is a, quote, most admired man. He's number 6 on the list of Man of the Year candidates. He's still seen as someone with great potential to sort of save the country from a Black revolution. Anyway, is sort of in the eyes of the state. And of course, by the way, we should understand that at least historically, if not so much today, the Washington Post has been not only one of the leading newspapers in the world, but primarily and specifically the mouthpiece of the state. That's where the political establishment most often would seek to plant its messaging. Traditionally, the New York Times was seen as the paper of record, the paper of the world, maybe the most popular. The Wall Street Journal, specific to the economic elite, the financial elite, but the political elite, the mouthpiece primarily, particularly at this time, was the Washington Post. So this is when this is discussed in the Post, it should be taken in that context and with that kind of weight. Similarly, in 1966, despite being considered the previous year, that is for 1965, a candidate for Man of the Year, a top candidate for Man of the Year, we already start to see that he's moving in a direction that will eventually put him in conflict with, again, that potential for him to escape his threatening label, primarily because he goes to Chicago and starts to bring his efforts in particularly the summers of 66 and 67 to Chicago, where he attempts to advance, quote unquote, the civil rights struggle. And he comes into conflict with the differences in between North and South. And that's where I think he was, becoming, and why I think he was becoming more clear and wanting to build with Malcolm X before he was assassinated, because there were important differences in the arrangements and relationships between Black and white communities, North and South. And as King thought he could bring some of those similar tactics in the South up North, thinking that he had survived Mississippi and Alabama, well, why not Chicago? Well, unfortunately, he was, met with the reality that Chicago was not much more different. And as Malcolm had pointed out, the real Mason-Dixon line is the Canadian border. If you're below that, you're in the South. So, but as you see here, he goes to Chicago and launches the most significant Northern freedom movement ever attempted by major civil rights groups, where he says, our primary objective will be to bring about the unconditional surrender of forces dedicated to the creation and maintenance of slums, and to ultimately make slums a financial and moral liability upon the whole community. Now, imagine even in many of these so-called ghettos and projects and neighborhoods that exist still in northern cities to this day, the most prominent civil rights leader in the world leading not just sit-ins and protests and events, but collecting the rents of all the tenants that would instead go to landlords and keeping them to be used to improve the conditions of those housing units. Imagine the threat that would mean to the establishment, even as we think about just not down far from where I am now in Baltimore, and what we've learned over the years of Trump Jr.'s relationship to public housing throughout the country, but even just right down the street here in Baltimore. Imagine if Trump family's reaction, if rents were not going to them and were being collected and redistributed in such a way that the horrible conditions people were forced to live in were being corrected. Similarly, the very next month, in February of 66, Dr. King meets Black Muslim leader for the first time. He sits down with Elijah Muhammad. Again, Elijah Muhammad also listed as a threat in the counterintelligence program documents. And we've already, as I briefly alluded to, where there was already an attempt to, in the press, to juxtapose King to Malcolm X, where Malcolm was meant to be seen as the threat and King meant to be seen as the acceptable option. And then here King is seen, at least in the mind's eye of the state, as moving closer towards that threat, while at the same time talking about what I just said a moment ago, collecting rents, and then saying that the rent presently being paid to the landlord would be paid to us. And then we will use the rent money to renovate the building. So he's in Chicago, he's meeting with Elijah Muhammad, he's talking about redistributing rents to take care of the conditions of the poor. He's not talking about event planning. He's not talking about simple sit-ins and symbolism. He's increasingly becoming, as we'll see, critical of legislation and its impact, and the electoral system and its impact, and capitalism on its own and its impact. The response is predictable. Similarly, later that same year, March 66, Dr. King decides actually to ignore Vietnam in his talk while visiting Sweden. He was pressured from all sides to not internationalize the struggle for civil rights. This is very important because even to this day, as we see, quote unquote movements rising that are popular online that are meant to replace these movements and are said to be even improvements specifically on the work of Dr. King, but who are also saying that Black Americans should isolate and make a singular, isolated effort for redress. That we see here historically, that has been what has been encouraged by the state and by liberal forces and conservative forces to prevent radical and revolutionary change. It is seen that internationalizing civil rights or internationalizing the Black struggle is a threat. It's a threat to the state, who want to project that democracy and capitalism, as it's branded here in the United States, is a saving grace for everybody, meaning really U.S. Interests and capital and influence is seen as a net positive around the world. For bourgeois, conservative, reactionary, or, plainly based liberal civil rights leaders who want to collect money from nonprofit and state-funded agencies and organizations. They don't want any internationalizing of those movements. Those looking to get funding and support from conservative religious outfits certainly don't want to internationalize those movements. So they put pressure on King, and at this moment, he acquiesced. But again, it's important to note, in comparison even to what's going on today, that the goal, the interests of those in power and those who stand in barrier against radical change don't want Black Americans to internationalize our struggle. Same thing here. April 1966, Dr. King warned to, quote, stick to his own knitting and to not talk about Vietnam and to not internationalize the civil rights struggle, which would, because if he talked about Vietnam, it would said that he would seriously, quote, seriously jeopardize new legislation meant to help Black people. So again, the argument, the just like we're told today, don't take certain political positions, even recently, don't quote, hashtag force the vote for Medicare for all, because you're going to threaten the ability for AOC and the squad and Nancy Pelosi to have positions of strength in Congress and to stand against the more reactionary Republicans. Don't talk about don't talk about quote unquote defunding the police because you can't get Democratic politicians elected and you can't advance your own interests. The same thing was said here 50 years ago. Don't compare the Black struggle to Vietnam. Don't compare the Black struggle to other colonized struggles and anti-colonial movements in the world. Don't seek solidarity with Pan-African unity. Don't do that because you jeopardize your own situation here. That's what the state is telling activists and movements then and now. So it is antithetical historically and today for people to make the argument that quote unquote Black America should, as it says here, stick to our own knitting and not make connections globally. Similarly, in May of 1966, we start to see already Dr. King's views, because he's even just raising these questions. His view in the mind's eye of those in power is starting to change. Dr. King is linked with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is seen as a youthful, more radical, militant wing of the civil rights struggle. Stokely Carmichael, et cetera, involved with that. And yet King is willing to work with them. And then here you have the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, getting 100,000 plus signatures to have King brought up on charges because of his willingness and interest in raising internationally concerns of the Black struggle here and his willingness to work with people to his left politically within the Black struggle here in the United States. So already you have people, so that it's, again, this idea that he is a hero and that he has always been welcomed and appreciated by this country and its political elite is again here shown to be patently false. Skipping ahead just a little bit, we know that in April of 1967, Dr. King gives his famous speech at Riverside Church, where he does come out publicly against the Vietnam War, and he does come out publicly saying things like bombs that are dropped overseas explode at home, because not only, well, in part because all of the resources used to kill Black and brown people overseas could be used and redistributed here to take care of so much of the inequality here. But instead, they would rather bomb Black and brown people for quote unquote wanting to become socialists or communists or wanting national sovereignty. And yet we're told here that there's no money or room for advance here. It sounds like, again, we hear the exact same thing today. We don't have money for healthcare. We can't afford healthcare. We can't afford a jobs program. We can't afford this. We can't afford that. But, oh, here's a hope in the CARES Act to make sure that the elite and hedge funds and major corporations can stay open and can have their stock value go up, and the 1% that own all that stock can keep themselves enriched, while many of the rest of us get furloughed, fired, lose businesses, jobs, et cetera, and certainly healthcare. But here in February of 68, King is explicitly making an appeal to the so-called Negro middle class. And he's challenging the class distinctions within Black America and the civil rights movement, explicitly saying that the so-called Black bourgeoisie is looking to take advantage of all of the gains of the civil rights movement. They're happily, moving into gentrifying neighborhoods and accepting positions at universities and political appointments here and there and wherever else. But meanwhile, the masses of Black people have their conditions worsening. Again, quickly fast forward to today, and almost everything, I shout out to Diedrich Muhammad initially, and then to the rest of the crew as far as I was introduced to it. The United for a Fair Economy reports that have been coming out since 2004, which are the State of the Dream reports, which have been pointing out basically annually that since 2004, at least annually since 2004, that since 1968 and Dr. King's assassination, the Black community has economically devolved in almost every major indicator of material conditions, largely because of the illusion of advance, because of the promotion of at least this is my interpretation of those reports, of the data of those reports, that largely or aided by the projection of a Black bourgeoisie, of a Black middle class, of a Black elite, of a Black political class, that has made advances. Well, here Dr. King is already saying, listen, the civil rights struggle was not meant for that. It was meant for the collective. And here we see that is already not the case. And then just sort of wrapping up this portion, not long, this is less than 90 days before he's assassinated. And I've always thought this is a very important headline. Not mentioned in this presentation. I mean, obviously he was demonized in the New York Times. He was demonized in Time and Newsweek. He was, going back even to certainly after his speech at Riverside Church, but even going back to previous statements where they were basically saying of him that he was, ruining his own, potential by leaning left. But here, and I've always, again, the headline is "Official Fears Grow" that Carmichael will seize Dr. King's March of the Poor. Now, we have to remember that in the summer of 1968, Dr. King was planning, the plan was a March of the Poor that would lead to permanent encampments of thousands of people who would rotate in and out in front of the White House, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, in other words, to not just march and go home, but to make a permanent display of the fact that, while the United States had no problem, again, going to war and transferring wealth ever upwards, the people on the bottom were suffering. And despite whatever gains were said to have come with civil rights legislation, Dr. King had become increasingly clear that, as he said himself, his dream had become a nightmare. He made allusions of the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation as rushing a football to the 50-yard line and claiming a touchdown. In other words, he made reference to the fact that he said a newly integrated lunch counter in the South was now raising the price of a hamburger from 25 cents to $2 to economically segregate Black people out. In other words, the same kind of trickery we see still happening today, Dr. King was already starting to identify. And again, he was ever moving leftward radically. So the reason the officials were fearing that his March of the Poor would be taken over by Stokely Carmichael, again referenced in that 1966 COINTELPRO document as a potential threat, was because Dr. King was willing to work with Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and was increasingly, radicalizing his own analysis, as we can talk about in a little bit, to incorporate ideas of socialism, even communism. And as it says here, official fears are growing among top officials in the White House and Justice Department, that MLK's March of the Poor will be a stunning victory for Stokely Carmichael. They make reference to, King being captured by Lenin and Leninism and the Communist Party. And all of these, for anybody who studies political assassination, who studies the history of this country and the state, anybody who certainly read the incredible work on, for instance, Malcolm X's assassination by Zach Kondo, Conspiracies, where he really lays out the context for what happens when the State Department and the Justice Department and intelligence agencies who surveil you start to raise these concerns. And what they're ultimately talking, and what he and others have pointed to historically, is that what this is ultimately doing is setting the context and preparation for physical assassination. If not, at minimum, it's meant to marginalize. And as the counterintelligence papers also demonstrate, there were attempts to marginalize King, isolate him from the Black community, even to get him to commit suicide. But if you can start to isolate someone intellectually or in the mind's eye of even their own community as a threat, Dhoruba bin Wahad has said that one of the reasons the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army were not more successful was that many in the Black community had believed or succumbed to the propaganda presented about them by the state. So this is again part of that warning, or that threat being projected publicly, that concern being projected publicly by the state, where they're saying here again that the official fears are growing that if Dr. King, with all of his popularity, is succumbing to these more leftist and threatening politics and activists, there's going to be a real problem. And if we remember the even broader context of the United States being in the so-called Cold War, and engaging in Vietnam and engaging in Korea and engaging in the attempted invasions of Cuba and the overthrows in Iran and in Chile and in eventually in Panama and other parts of Central and South America, we have to that all of this is happening, and the assassinations of Patrice Lumumba and Maurice Bishop and so many others is all happening in the context of trying to fight against the spread, or the specter, as Marx once said, of communism. And redistributionist politics. And it's just like it's happening now. And we mentioned yesterday in our great talk with Dr. Karanja about Assata Taught Me Beyond the Slogan, that part of the reason why Assata Shakur and Cuba are mentioned again as terrorist threats just the other day in the New York Times is because, I think at least, that as people are becoming again more attuned, obviously, to the horrific nature of our economic and social system and its impact on the majority of the people in this country and around the world, they want to raise questions about alternatives. And one way to make sure that they don't go too far with those alternatives, and as the counterintelligence program, as we started with, mentioned, you want to project the idea that, as was also pointed out in those papers, if Black youth want to become nationalists and revolutionaries, they need to learn that they'll become dead revolutionaries. Which, of course, unfortunately takes us here to April 4th, 1968, where Dr. King is assassinated. And on April this year, we'll come back to this in more detail, because don't have time this morning, but a full discussion, and with others more expert on this certainly than me, we should be involved in that conversation, and for a longer conversation. But it is important to note that Merrill McCullough, the first to Dr. King's body, was an undercover Memphis police agent who would eventually, as a result of his work here that day, evolve his career, so to speak, into the CIA. And he's also, as Dr. William Pepper and others have pointed out over the years, he's the first to point erroneously, to lead all of these folks pointing erroneously away from where the shot actually came from, and then starts to distort the entire context of King's assassination, who would have done it, how it would have been done, and why. But certainly his presence there suggests that it was far more than just the popular story of James Earl Ray. And in fact, even as the King Center in Memphis has a section noting there's a tremendous amount, some might even call it overwhelming amount, of evidence that suggests the state was involved in King's assassination, as was the case with Malcolm X, as some have suggested, with less evidence, unfortunately, but is likely the case with even Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. one of the problems that we're struggling with, I think, in terms of many things, but in terms of how we understand Dr. King now, that we're often encouraged to see him as sort of an empty, politically empty, or certainly politically softened version of what he actually was and was becoming, being too big to fail, so to speak, being too big to omit as a historical figure. He is just constantly rebranded and assaulted posthumously as he was physically dealt with in life. As I continue to say, Dr. King is the most known and least understood human in the history of the world, second maybe only to the historical Jesus Christ. And as a result, he is referenced as much as anyone, and with as little understanding or context as anyone. Or as we often want to tell people when it comes to Dr. King,
you just don't read, beloved.
All right, so let's get into it. All right, so here's the chapter in question, chapter 4, Balanced and Guarded, Martin Luther King Jr. on the Arab-Israeli tightrope. And where they start off, or where the author starts off with this, is to talk about how King grappled, at least in his own mind, to the extent he didn't do it publicly and in his inner circles, with the occupation of Palestine and having to juxtapose a need to remain nonviolent in his philosophy and approach, to defend Jews and Israel, and particularly Jews supporting his efforts in the civil rights struggle, and also to balance the emerging radicalism in the Black community, the Black Power movement, and his own consciousness. So despite what Amy Schumer and many others have wanted to try to do with Dr. King, it's way more complicated than, of course, they would be wanting to give credit or want to acknowledge, certainly not wanting to concern themselves with the complexities of Black people's history and thought. But as he's quoted here as saying that there were dark days before, but this is the darkest. And of course, what Dr. King was talking about was the 1967 Arab-Israeli war, or conflict, or invasion, or so. A lot of this chapter focuses on King's struggle with whether he should go for another visit, because in 1959 or 1957, I'll check that in a second, he had actually gone to the West Bank as part of a trip. And I think it's the first time I'll come back to it in the article, but one of the few times, not the first time, someone of his stature in civil rights made such a visit to the West Bank. But that, as he noted here, he said, but when it came to going again, as he had been planning to before the breakout of that 1967 war, he said that he didn't think he could make that visit and not come out unscathed. Because as this article points out, and as many might want to particularly the reverse hashtag community that wants to make use of King in reference to some vacuous call for getting a reparations check. The reality is that King was an internationalist, and it is correct here, for the most part, as Fishbach writes, that King did not simply champion the struggle of American Blacks. He also spoke out against war, poverty, and injustice more generally. In particular, he watched events in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as anti-colonial struggles broke out left and right in the 1950s and 60s. He called for a boycott of the racist regime in South Africa, and in December of 1957, he gave a speech in which he acknowledged the interconnectedness of global struggles for independence, with that being waged by Blacks in America. Quote, the determination of Negro Americans to win freedom from all forms of oppression springs from the same deep longing that motivates oppressed peoples all over the world. The rumblings of discontent in Asia and Africa are expressions of a quest for freedom and human dignity by people who have long been the victims of colonialism and imperialism, end quote. So again, when people start to project what King would be saying about this conflict or other conflicts, he was clearly laying out a political trajectory well before he was assassinated. And in fact, some would argue, probably myself included, that this is in part what led to that assassination. Contrary to what generally is written about King, he was not a knee-jerk supporter of Israel to the detriment of Palestinians and other Arabs. So, of course, King, being a preacher, being steeped in sort of that tradition and mythology, like many, he saw connections between his ministry and the plight and suffering of the ancient Hebrews, and I would argue mistakenly applied that mythology to an understanding of literal history, and then misapplied that misunderstanding to the literal history of today's European descended Jews and Israelis. But the point being, this is one of the pulls on King. These traditions, these mythologies. Then there's the political pull of needing support from American Jews for the civil rights movement, or feeling that he needed this support, which is, of course, an ongoing major contradiction. And then the other pole of Black militancy and radicalism. So, as I said, the book talks about, this chapter talks about King making a trip to the West Bank in 1959, feeling it necessary, even as part of his again nonviolent ministry. And it marked the first time that a major figure in the Black freedom struggle actually visited the Palestinians' homeland. So again, whatever people might want to say, trying to ascribe their politics to King, he felt it necessary to meet with and show solidarity with Palestinians. The chapter goes into a discussion of him meeting with Palestinians and displaced Palestinian people and what impact this had on him. Having dinner with displaced people, no longer able to live in their homes. And when he came back, the chapter talks about the impact of the trip on his subsequent sermons. A walk through the Holy Land. He may have been including the Middle East when he spoke these words about the third world and struggles of its people, words that were also relevant to the Black Americans sitting in the pews before him. I think we know today there is a struggle, a desperate struggle going on in this world. 2/3 of the people of the world are colored people. They have been dominated politically, exploited economically, trampled over and humiliated. There is a struggle on the part of these people to gain freedom and human dignity. So again, it's truly disrespectful, even to the extent that some of these arguments are correct, to reduce King and others to a platitude here or there that is politically convenient, when so much of the context is left out, and an appreciation for the people in the study and the history of the people being discussed, in this case Black people or Palestinians, is largely irrelevant. In October of 1964, for example, he received a letter from an American living in Israel who brought to his attention Israel's discriminatory policies towards Palestinian minority. This American Jew made the comparison himself between Israel and South Africa, trying to help King better understand. And in fact, if you read this article for yourself, of course, I would not article, the chapter of this book yourself, the American Jew living in Israel spoke similarly to the experience that was passed down to me about my own mother's people, that they had been invited to this sort of socialist kibbutzim style in Israel, and then they realized that Zionism was a colonial project displacing and oppressing Palestinians, and they weren't down for it. My mother's folks ended up leaving well before Israel was created. This particular American Jew stayed, but still noted what was happening and wanted King to be aware of it. And then the chapter, I'm not going to do too much with this. The chapter goes into the backs and forth that King had about trying to determine whether or not he would go visit the Middle East again. He ultimately does not go, because he does not want to be seen as being supportive of the oppression of Palestinians by Israelis, while he's also trying to connect the struggle of Black people to anti-colonial movements around the world. But he also doesn't want to be too explicit about this, because he doesn't want to upset the support of American Jews whose support was often sought by King and the mainstream civil rights activist community. So ultimately, King does cancel all of those subsequent trips and is assassinated before he can ever go back. One point that Schumer and many others would not want to bring up is the fact that a lot of King's conflict internally around support for Israel or lack thereof was the result of was a culmination of his increasing radicalism that was sort of signified in the famous or infamous, from the perspective of the state, 1967 Riverside Church speech, A Time to Break the Silence, where he condemns the U.S. war in Vietnam. He condemns colonial imposition of all kinds, and is seen increasingly as a threat to national security by the state. But this also begins to inform how King looks at the state of Israel. Now, this is one part of the chapter that really struck my interest because of my ever increasing focus and critique of Black capitalism and its messaging. And I thought this was very interesting because King's strategy to try to walk that tightrope, as this chapter is describing, was to defend Israel's right to exist, but condemn the economic oppression that it imposed on the Palestinian and Arab community. As the chapter says here, King therefore chose to balance his public assertion of Israel's right to exist with an indirect acknowledgement of the Arab point of view, but in economic, not political terms. He chose to speak about how poverty and the lack of economic development in the Arab world kept the pot of violence and war boiling, and eschewed any overt discussion of the political basis of Arab grievances such as Palestinian dispossession, the fate of the 1948 refugees, compensation for their property losses, and so forth. So as I noted when reading this, here King reverses his argument for Black people and avoids the reality of political power. This is an acknowledgement that focus on economics, quote unquote Palestinian capitalism, is a concession to power and is itself not real power at all. Because as I've talked about extensively with King and the claim that King spoke explicitly against concepts of Black buying power and Black banking and Black capitalism, saying that billions of federal investment would need to be required, and political power and redistribution would all be essential if Black people were to ever be free or equal, et cetera. But because he's walking this tightrope, he does what is now done to us today. You can almost get away with couching the problems exclusively along the terms of economics if you're not talking about it in the context of colonialism, capitalism, and exploitation in that way. And you're simply saying if we address their poverty and address some of this gap in inequality, we can lessen the horrors. And in that way, the tightrope we're asked to walk today, and that pundits are inviting us to walk today, is to say, I know Black people are suffering, but I'm not going to advocate that they organize for political power. I'm just going to say, get your money right. And that's what King was saying to the Palestinians then. And in this case, he was wrong. But I just thought that was wild that he reverses himself when talking about Palestinians, because he knows full well in terms of Black people that that's not going to work. But he also knows, and as this chapter points out, that the removal of the occupation is not really on the table. So to walk the line while having to say Israel has a right to exist, we just need to lessen the violence and the oppression of Palestinians. He can get away with that, or he hoped he could get away with that, but it's insufficient. And see, because he does say here, and this is something, again, the Amy Schumers of the world won't want to quote. And this is speaking in June of 1967. King says, I think for the ultimate peace and security of the situation, it will probably be necessary for Israel to give up this conquered territory.
Message!
Because to hold on to it will only exacerbate the tensions and deepen the bitterness of the Arabs. These were prescient words indeed. And it's interesting, this chapter is pointing out that that part was a comment that came when he was, quote, pressed to comment about whether Israel should return the Arab territories it occupied during the war. King was forced to get off message and go beyond the palatable platitudes to answer that specific political question. And again, I love the way this is the political question that King wanted to avoid. But when pressed, he said, unlike what Amy Schumer and others would often want to quote and would be left out of the video clips, et cetera, that would be circulated by pro-Israel Zionists, et cetera, and so forth, is that King said you probably have to give up the conquered territory if you want to stop the violence. That's the political question. You can't just encourage some reduction in the gap of material inequality or income or wealth. You can't just tell Palestinians to circulate their dollar or to start a business. That's not going to work. That's not the issue. You have to come up off that territory. But as the chapter goes on, it really does make clear that King never really elevated politically to the level of those on his left, namely Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael. He doesn't. He comes into conflict with what's described here as the SNCC newsletter controversy, which was ultimately condemning Israel and Zionism as racism and colonialism and siding with the Palestinians and recognizing that Palestinians were colonized like Black people here and that their struggles were identical or similar, if not identical. And then this enormous array of Jewish organizations all reached out, including the Anti-Defamation League, all reached out to King by telegram shortly after the conference ended. The 1967 National Conference for New Politics in Chicago dropped a statement condemning Israel and Zionism, starting the June War. King had spoken at the beginning of that conference, didn't apparently realize how radical it was going to end up being, and then was called to condemn them and to separate himself from the rest of them, distance himself from the gathering because of the statement on Israel, again, as being Zionist and colonialist. Richard Russell, a Jewish businessman, activist, and part owner of Ramparts magazine. Russell was close to King and occupied a seat in the executive board of the National Conference for New Politics. He indicated that he was resigning from the committee because he had tried and failed to have a fellow board member, Stokely Carmichael, removed. King adopted this suggestion, one coming from Stanley Levinson, his confidant and sometimes co-author. King adopted this suggestion almost verbatim. That is the suggestion that he say that Israel's right to exist as a state and its security is incontestable. So King did reconfirm that Israel has a right to exist. And what is described here is his two-pronged approach, trying to balance support for Israel with a recognition that the roots of the problem lay in the region's economic underdevelopment. That was the hustle, as I'm calling it. But again, it's a lot more nuanced than Amy Schumer would want to say, and of course, and others, and all of them leave out King's increasing radicalism elsewhere. But on this issue, he had not been given the chance to properly evolve politically, I would argue. It's clear to me where he was headed, but you can see the forces aligned to inhibit it. So King did, that is, offer up a statement on behalf of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, stating that Israel's right to exist as a state in security is incontestable. At the same time, the great powers have the obligation to recognize the Arab world is in a state of imposed poverty and backwardness, and that this must threaten peace and harmony. So the chapter talks a little bit about this being part of Andy Young's plan as well, to as a statesman, to again avoid the political, make note of the reality of the imposed poverty. But if you're not demanding Israel give up territory, or if you're not demanding or challenging Israel's right to exist, or not challenging its occupation or settler colonial status, there is no upending the imposed poverty. So this is just, to me, a shortcoming in King's approach. But as the chapter does say here, rather than simply blaming each side, especially the Arabs, for intransigence or fanaticism, the statement instead offered a left-wing sounding economic analysis by noting that at the heart of the problem are oil interests. The SCLC statement condemned anti-Semitism firmly and clearly. SCLC will continue tirelessly to condemn racism, whether its form is white supremacy or anti-Semitism. King knew the issue was going to get worse. He noted that Israel's use of military power to subdue the Arabs was no solution, a point Amy Schumer and others would leave out. So again, even if you want to quote him as supporting the existence of Israel and condemning anti-Semitism, he was also condemning the violent oppression and imposed poverty of Palestinians. But he did separate himself from Black power advocates. He did separate himself, and according to this, took swipes at Black nationalists and their vision of racial solidarity with the Third World, by stating that such people were color consumed and see a kind of mystique in being colored. But he did acknowledge the plight of the Arab community and sought to have them brought into the conversation, where he would end up saying peace for Israel means security. On the other hand, we must see that peace for Arabs means in a real sense of security on another level. Peace for the Arabs means the kind of economic security that they do so desperately need. These nations, as you know, are part of that third world of hunger, disease, of illiteracy. I think that as long as these conditions exist, there will be tensions, there will be endless quests to find scapegoats. 10 days later, King was dead. All right, so so obviously on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated, and even before then, but certainly since then, he has been rebranded out of almost recognition from the man that actually existed. So as I've talked about before, I've been in a slow motion read of this book with several others. Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Critique of Racial Capitalism by Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins. And they have a chapter in here titled Showdown for Nonviolence on Black Radicalism and the Anti-Political. Between that and the posthumously published essay from Dr. King, Showdown for Nonviolence, from which the book chapter gets its title and focus, we can do some things, because some things need doing, and folks are attempting to get us in the right direction, I think. So as it says here, Dr. King had already been assassinated by James Earl Ray in Memphis. Or at least say I don't agree with what is being this description. But when this was, in other words, this article appeared after Dr. King was killed. And it's a great read. It's very worth a read or a reread or a reminder for a number of different reasons. Just off the top, that as Dr. King says in the second paragraph, well, first, as the authors in Prophets of Discontent, remind us that Dr. King starts off this essay by appropriately setting the context of violence being one of a monopoly of it being held by the state and exercised by the state. And he calls for, that is, Dr. King calls for very clearly something that is often left out of these posthumous references to him, where he says, non-violent direct action enabled the Negro to take to the streets in active protest, but it muzzled the guns of the oppressor because even he could not shoot down in daylight unarmed men, women, and children. So Dr. King is saying tactically, we can't go to war with these folks straight up. And this is something that I don't know. I mean, the one thing that I wasn't able to fully prepare for today, but I think is cool because it should just be an ongoing conversation but I did want to raise as a question is, how right or wrong is Dr. King tactically when he says we must engage in nonviolent direct action? Not so much as his emphasis on some moral, philosophical, religious-based, ethical, whatever, but tactically because the military might of the U.S. can't be defeated by direct confrontation is his point. So he's saying nonviolent but direct action is necessary. And I'm wondering, so I was going back and I'm looking at Blood in My Eye from George Jackson. I'm going back and reading the BLA study guide. I'm just wondering if King is right, or is the argument around not direct confrontation per se is an open warfare per se, but the point of George Jackson and the BLA is as I understood it, and I'm not advocating, but just asking the question, just curiosity, can guerrilla warfare destabilize society to the point where it must change in a progressive, revolutionary way. So that's just one question that I had to throw out there. Was King right? And was King right even though he doesn't acknowledge, he mentions guerrilla warfare in this essay a number of times, actually, and threatens that it's on its way. But he doesn't consider it from the perspective, certainly, of a George Jackson a few years later, or a BLA a few years later, in terms of how it would be carried out, that is guerrilla warfare, and to what extent it would be successful. King argues it would not be successful, but is warning that it's not something that can be prevented if the country doesn't change. So as he says, what I believe is on page 70 in this PDF, or page 4, but I'm convinced that if something isn't done to deal with the very harsh and real economic problems of the ghetto, the talk of guerrilla warfare is going to become much more real. The nation has not yet recognized the seriousness of it. So King is raising that, is saying, listen, the country has to change, but he's also saying to Black people, it's not going to work. We don't, you know. He says earlier, but I'm frank enough to admit that if our nonviolent campaign doesn't generate some progress, people are just going to engage in more violent activity, and the discussion of guerrilla warfare will be more extensive. So King is hearing things. He's listening to the people. He's been in Chicago and heard the northern versions and seen the northern versions of the struggle, has seen where the limitations of his previous efforts, but his response is not cowardice, and it is not to do nothing. And it is not simply to be nonviolent. It is to be engaged in nonviolent direct action. And in this essay, he talks about, that is, King talks about, the development of thousands-strong permanent encampments that will go on and on until change is developed. We've selected 15 areas, 10 cities, and 5 rural districts from which we have recruited our initial cadre. Interesting, I think he's using that language. Was King always using that language? He's talking guerrilla warfare, cadre. We will have 200 poor people from each area. That would be about 3,000 to get out the protests going and set the pattern. They are important, particularly in terms of maintaining nonviolence. They are being trained in this discipline now. So he's calling for a protracted national struggle that destabilizes and puts pressure on Congress to enact what he says is an economic bill of rights that would guarantee a job to all and a guaranteed income. In other words, King is focused on, again, the state as the dominant and monopolist in terms of purveyor of violence and holder of violent capabilities. The talk, as he says, of guerrilla warfare will intensify among Black people if the nonviolent movement does not succeed. Tactically, that will not work, guerrilla warfare. It will be, as he describes, a Holocaust. He uses the word Holocaust. When he says, if it fails, nonviolence will be discredited and the country may be plunged into Holocaust, a tragedy deepened by the awareness that it was avoidable. So in this summary of her lecture here, because I also got this in my alerts as well, author Maggie Anderson sheds light on MLK and Black-owned business. Now this is, okay, so this is part of the rebranding that I do talk a little bit about in my book, that historical figures are taken in, are cherry-picked in isolation, out of, in a vacuum, out of their context, and often misquoted, misreferenced, misinterpreted for the very, very Black capitalist encouraged purpose of promoting Black entrepreneurialism as a pathway to Black liberation. Again, as I talk about it, my broader argument is that the broader politics of this is to draw us away from the radical analyses and movement power that we actually have, okay? So in this case, Dr. King is evoked to talk about how, well, Anderson added that people didn't hear King say, buy Black, because he didn't have to. The Black businesses were right there funding his fight, allowing his audacity, she said. He didn't have to build them up. They built King up. We had economic unity. We were united, and united we always have more power than pain. End quote. Now, this is part of, again, this massive problem that we have, the rebranding of Dr. King out of his context, and in this case, wildly inaccurately, as I'm about to show you. But for the purposes of trying to rebrand the struggle as if it was somehow Black entrepreneurs and businesses that were funding and driving the civil rights movement, and not something that King would aggressively come back to critique himself. Now, please, go back if you don't, want to see many other things. Please go back and check the video I did last month, specifically about Dr. King and his rebranding, where I go through some of the in more detail. And I'll link to it here in the description for this one, but where I go in more detail to and show you the rebranding in the press and how, as he became more overtly radical and critical of the Black bourgeoisie and white liberals and Black capitalism and capitalism in general, he became more distanced and marginalized from the civil rights struggle, from the mainstream press, and ultimately from the state, who was happy to promote his being a threat to national security repeatedly, which of course paves the way for him to be assassinated and have that assassination rebranded as something almost cartoonish and unrecognizable. But that's a whole other, obviously discussion as well. But you can go back to the video for some of that. But here, my point would only be, and as I'll show you what I have just been, for whatever reasons, neglecting to reintroduce or into newer work or newer presentations and discussions of this, is again how this is entirely an intentional misrepresentation. I have to think, let me not say, I don't know that it's intentional, but it is a misrepresentation, a misinterpretation of Dr. King. And it is meant to feed the bias of Black business and entrepreneurialism being the pathway. By the way, in that lecture, Maggie Anderson goes on to talk about Du Bois in the same context as well. Again, rebranding the most radical anti-capitalist critics of some of the more prominently known, at least, anti-capitalist Black critics in the modern era as people who supported Black business and entrepreneurialism and capitalism as a pathway to liberation. It's really frustrating and never mind inaccurate. So again, she's saying he never said. Again, remember, we didn't hear it. She's saying, and I want to just read that again because to properly set up what I want to show you. She's saying again, people didn't hear King say buy Black because he didn't have to, because those businesses were already right there funding his fight, allowing his audacity. Okay, that's deep. It wasn't the movement. It wasn't even, the community or the church or the broader struggles or anything else. It wasn't the other organizations, the other elements of the struggle. It wasn't anything else. It was Black businesses allowing his audacity. But she says, again, he did not say, we didn't hear King say buy Black because he didn't have to, she says. Well, in fact, he did say buy Black. And he said it right here in his last full-length book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Where he says, and honestly, it just required me going back and putting in the search in the Kindle piece to be reminded of this. However much we pool our resources, Dr. King wrote, and buy Black, this cannot create the multiplicity of new jobs and provide the number of low-cost houses that will lift the Negro out of the economic depression caused by centuries of deprivation. Neither can our resources supply quality integrated education. All of this requires billions of dollars, which only an alliance of liberal labor civil rights forces can stimulate. In short, the Negro's problem cannot be solved unless the whole of American society takes a new turn towards greater economic justice, end quote.
Now listen, that's called my boy.
So already right there in the trailer, you see a couple of things. You see the similar framing that we've often gotten. King and Malcolm weren't that different, or King and Malcolm were thought to be different, but were they that? How different were they? What were their similarities? They both wanted the same thing. They had the same goals. You see Peniel Joseph already in there as the key voice, sort of narrating the trailer already, setting this tone for what appears to be the the updating of the standard approach. King was nonviolent, Malcolm was violent. They both went through some changes. Usually that's described as King, quote unquote, sort of politically softening and moving to his right to adopt a more Kingian sort of politics. King is never credited or rarely credited or acknowledged with moving ever more to his left politically, and if showing that the joining of forces that was developing between Malcolm and Martin was evolving more on the basis of Malcolm's radical politics than anything else. But yet and still, it is that juxtaposition of one against the other, with what appears to be the attempt to tell us that to the extent that, as the counterintelligence program said of Dr. King, he adhered to white liberalism and nonviolence, he was acceptable. Similar to what we've already discussed in terms of Peniel Joseph's work around Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Malcolm X, to the extent that they moved left of the Democratic Party, left of sort of mainstream civil rights consensus, they lost value, lost their way, lost their relevance. With Joseph's involvement here, I will and happily be checked if I'm wrong, continue to assume initially that that's the frame that's going to be brought here. That, in other words, that they are going to be juxtaposed against one another, and to the extent that one is or the other is redeemable, it will be on the basis of them moving ever to the right to a more liberal, I might call neoliberal politic, et cetera, and so forth. And in each case, the actual radical politics that Malcolm and Martin dealt with will not be centered, given just due, focused, if included or referenced even at all. All right, but if we look a little bit at this Variety article, I think it gives a little bit more context to my own initial thoughts and gives us a little more information about what is the attempt here. So, Genius MLK X sets a premiere date. It's going to be in February, just in time for Black History Month, of course, with the first 2 episodes appearing on February 1st. But as it says here, unlike past seasons, this season of Genius will tell the story of 2 geniuses: civil rights movement leaders, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Rest in peace, Andre Brower. I just see that he passed, and I see that I was actually a big fan of his, particularly back in the day on Homicide, and his interrogation box scenes are classic in terms of good writing, I think, and good propaganda. It was well done propaganda, but a big fan of his. And of course, he did propaganda as well on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but that contradiction notwithstanding, he did it very well. He was a brilliant actor, and I am sorry for his loss, and peace to his family. But as Variety continues here, the official description of the season states that it will follow both King and X from their formative years, where they were molded by strong fathers and traumatic injustices, to their rich parallel stories as they shaped their identities and became the change they wished to see in the world. Influenced as children by different upbringings and experiences, King by the Jim Crow era South and life in the church, before finding his voice at Morehouse and Boston University, and X growing up under constant deadly violence of the Klan and falling into a life of vice and incarceration, where he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and found his voice. The 2 visionaries ultimately rose to pioneer a movement. You can see here some of the people featured in as cast. I'm sure they're very talented and beautiful people. But what is of most interest to me is this part here, where there's a discussion and description of the think tank of historians and experts who served as production consultants prior to the start of the writer's room to guide the production, including, in alphabetical order, Jamal Joseph, who I did reach out to and invited to discuss this, and should he ever respond, I'll let you all know, and maybe he'll join us here, and if not here, elsewhere, and we'll happily check that out as well. But of course, my main concern was seeing this. We already heard his voice and saw him featured prominently in the trailer. I'm not at all surprised, and have been predicting for
going on almost 2 decades now, that Joseph would become a permanent problem in reproducing a neoliberal narrative of Black radical histories and individuals. Links to previous work on that and even our debate, I'll put in the show description. You can check that out for yourselves. But I'm not surprised, and again, have even predicted he would be here. Barbara Reynolds, if folks want to go back, I'll make sure that's in the show description as well. She is discussed by my godfather, Mr. Tom Porter, in a very critical way, for her versions of him and Jesse Jackson in her previous work. Noted here, Jesse Jackson's America's David. And I also would want to note Jeff Stetson, because it says here that the meeting he authored, of course, the famous play going back several decades now, the meeting between Dr. King and Malcolm X, a fictional depiction of them having a meeting. I did go back and watch it, a version of it at least on YouTube, and was reminded of what I've always thought it to be, a very, with all due respect, sophomoric introduction to the two men, and that does what I fear is being done in a new version in this forthcoming film. It just sort of sets up that base, again, sophomoric juxtaposition of King versus Malcolm. And what if we had put down our what if we had joined forces earlier, and what we could have done. Again, no real discussion of their radical politics, ever increasing, particularly for Dr. King. No discussion of the state. No discussion of the counterintelligence program. No discussion of the assassinations. No discussion of all of the broader anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, radical politics that both men were increasingly involved with and targeted and assassinated for. So it's perfect that he would be involved here, not only as having been the inspiration for the series, but having written the pilot for it and serving as executive producer. So I think these are warning signs as to what we can expect we're going to get from this forthcoming series. Now, also, as this Blavity article reminds us, this is a Disney product. Disney owns National Geographic, or I think 70+% of it. It's airing on Hulu, which is a Disney product. So we should be reminded of this, and we've discussed this previously about what this means, and I'll even put the link in the show description where we talked about not only what this means in terms of these histories becoming Disney products, but that Disney and what it means when Disney and Disney-like companies are actually the ones owning the likenesses to these figures like Malcolm X. I don't think it's Disney in particular that owns Malcolm's likeness, but that company is discussed in that video we did about a year or so ago. So I'll put that in the link description. The point being, these histories, these images, these likenesses, these windows to our past are not controlled by us. They're not owned by us. They're not designed with a frame for us to access these histories and people for for the purposes that those people themselves had, and for us to pick up the radical traditions that they represented and to advance them. That's not why they exist. They exist to do quite the opposite. That was, and again, is the point of the comical reference both to the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance, to the penny trick of Peniel Joseph, the nominal reference to individuals and histories that are themselves radical and revolutionary, but are depicted in very neoliberal frames, so that when they are passed on to our youth, again, much like the fifth tenet of the counterintelligence program directed at Black communities, mandates in a way that will discourage Black youth from becoming radical. And as the oppression of Black people continues, there needs to be a constant assault on the consciousness of those communities, and in particular, the radical traditions that might inform revolutionary responses to that ongoing oppression. So just as we see here, now, I did mention, I think I mentioned in, maybe it was in another instance or edit, but I thought that it would be interesting to do a series that focused on Betty and Coretta. If you're going to juxtapose people, it would be interesting to see if those two would be actually given the due that they deserve as individuals and also representatives of broader histories and struggles. What would it would be interesting to see them get uh, centered, but again, not here. As much as I would like to see the lives of Betty Shabazz and Coretta Scott King depicted and given more attention, I don't want it to be in the context that their husbands are constantly posthumously abused. Uh, but according to Blavity, this series is going to bring their wives, Coretta Scott King and Betty Shabazz, who are often portrayed as peripheral figures, to the forefront and shows them as formidable equals of the movement. And then it goes on to point out, as we saw in the trailer, that neither Malcolm nor Martin would have become who they were without the other. So also, again, I want to just quickly bring up a point or two I made or have been trying to make in for a number of years, and is discussed in this presentation that I put together some years ago, and the one attempt at a Prezi I ever engaged. It's not a very well done Prezi. The content is dope and accurate, of course, but the presentation it is what it is. But there's a couple points from this that I wanted to make that are I think predictably coming up again in this framing and the way Malcolm and Martin are juxtaposed. Now, again, there is, I think, a valuable way it could be done. That is the juxtaposition of Malcolm against Martin, the kinds of politics they represented, the paths to their conclusions that they took, et cetera, and so forth. I think there is value there. I think some of that work has been done well in the past. I was even thinking, James Cone had a book, I think, comparing the two of them and their religious approaches or something like that. Maybe we should get a copy for Diallo. But what is often done is as I think is described in some of the research I found for this presentation some years ago, that I think is still of value here. So I just wanted to bring renewed attention to it. First, just again to remind, immediately after the March on Washington, William Sullivan, working on behalf of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, was already saying that we must mark Dr. King now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future of this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. We've talked about this before repeatedly. This was also in the context of a fear that King's leadership would take Black people towards an affinity for and defense of and solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. So even with the relatively soft and liberal I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King was already moving beyond mainstream civil rights, what was sanctionable by the state and mainstream civil rights, and it was noted already by the highest levels and the most vicious levels of the federal government. So what I've always just wanted to quickly try to point out, and again, we can assess this, and I'll predict that it's not going to appear in this forthcoming series, but this is sort of the point that I've been trying to make as it relates to these two, and that how we see them, what we see not considered when each are themselves considered individually, or certainly again in juxtaposition against the other. And that is, just quickly, in each case, Malcolm and Martin, they both express deep commitments to Black unity and extending that unity to global anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles. Both expressed a fealty to anti-capitalist ideas. Both expressed strong and particular criticism of the Black bourgeoisie and white liberals. Both expressed zero confidence in legislation and conventional methods of protest politics. Again, both were advocating that we differently approach electoral politics, not simply voting for the lesser of evils or to stop one or another fascist, this, that, or the other. And then lastly, both expressed support for direct action campaigns. And I don't know to what extent, particularly, that point will be made clear. I have zero confidence that point will be made clear in this series. If anything, they're going to try to make it seem like that Malcolm was walking away from armed struggle and King towards a King that was seen as representing those politics. But even as the counterintelligence program documents stated themselves, they were concerned that if King left his obedience for liberalism and nonviolent doctrines, he would become the number one threat to the state. But it was his direct action campaigns and advocacy calls that made him the threat and that are often ignored when King is himself considered. Malcolm never disavowed armed struggle, self-defense, and even guerrilla warfare. So we can be, I guarantee that will not be depicted correctly, if at all, in this series. But that is a point that should always be considered and remembered. Now, specifically, the argument of Powell and Amundsen is something I still think is vitally important when we understand when we try to understand how King and X both were politically in their lives, but how they're depicted posthumously. And as they wrote, the media created an image of Malcolm X as a violent, power-hungry extremist who was primarily interested in harming the white population in the United States. And that's why Wendy Wolf, the Viking Press publisher and editor for Manning Marable's a Life of Reinvention, expressed that fear of Malcolm and what he represented to her community of white liberals. Contrasting Malcolm X with Martin Luther King Jr. in the media fostered this negative image. The two men were described as opposite ends of a spectrum. King is advocating nonviolence. X is advocating violence. King is a black minister. X is an ex-convict. King is a civil rights leader. X is a racial fanatic. And I'm sure to whatever extent that Genius and Disney tried to adjust this frame, it will be to show that Malcolm was much more like King than we would want, and much more like the King they would want us to think King was than the King that actually was. Similarly, they wrote, Black Muslims and thus Malcolm X were characterized as extremists within the media. The media created this image with the terms used to describe Malcolm X and Black Muslims: anti-Christian, anti-white, alienation, agitators, black supremacy, bitter, confrontation, cult, enemy, extremists, exploit, hate, militant, separation, sect, threat, and trouble. These terms appeared frequently and with high intensity, shaping a negative image of Malcolm X in the media. The New York Times, in particular, constructed oppositional identities of the two leaders. Malcolm X was framed as a doppelganger to King. They were portrayed as opposite men with opposite goals. And I'm not going to belabor the point here, but I did just want to quickly show again the article, the story that came out from earlier this year that we covered in our discussion with Dr. Burroughs of Jonathan Eag's new book on Dr. King and all of its flaws. Eag was pointing out the I don't know, revelation that if it was to some, that the quote that is often or had been often attributed to Dr. King condemning the work of Malcolm X was itself false, wasn't reported accurately, it wasn't true. And my point in bringing it up here is that is only to say that there have always been, and has in addition to the media description I just covered a moment ago, there has always been an effort to distort the relationship between King and X and to distort each of them individually in and post their lives. So to see Genius and Disney coming back again to do their version of this, or to update that constant juxtaposition and false representation of each, and false comparisons to each, and false dichotomies created for each through each. Just as a quick reminder, there's a history and a legacy of this being an issue. Just a quick warning, yet another warning for, again, 2024 is looking bad. As Daruba says, it's looking bad for the home team as it pertains to the depiction of these histories and individuals and the politics that they dealt with and advocated. So we have to stay vigilant on our Vernon philosophy. And again, remember, Vernon philosophy isn't calling for a material boycott. It is an intellectual boycott. It is saying, I know many of us are going to engage these media products. Our people, our students, our families are going to engage these media products. And I do think we have to be able to offer up an analysis and a critique, but also to have some prophylactic protection of sorts, intellectual prophylactic protection, self-defensive fitness, again, as Chuck D in Public Enemy once said, and being reminded of what the Vernon philosophy holds as its core tenet, that oppressed people, colonized people, Black people in particular here in the United States, cannot, should not look to see themselves or accurate depictions of themselves in mainstream commercial media. All that is popular is fraudulent. All that is popular is a false claim and representation, or worse, is a conscious attempt at psychological warfare against the people and the subjects it claims to represent.
But these writers have done an excellent job because let's point out how they start the book, Dr. Ball, before I get to my notes. See, I didn't know this part. That's why I had to deal with the sheet over my head that you pulled off over, my head. I really appreciate it. Andy Young starts talking some bullshit in the beginning. Remember in the beginning of the book there at Belfani's house? He starts talking some bullshit, and King interrupts him and says, Andy, you're a capitalist. I'm not.
But that's...
I'm not, and that's deep. That's deep. I never read that before. Never heard that before. Never heard Belafonte say
Yes, you
that.
have. Yes, you have.
Where?
Because in the early 2000s, Mr. Porter gave me 2 speeches that King gave to the SCLC leadership that are, one of which at least, if not both of them, are quoted in this book. And I have the hard copy somewhere in the basement of at least one of them. And he said all of this stuff. It details all of the where he's arguing with Andy Young. He's telling he's telling these folks capitalism is the problem. The logic, he said, the logic, the logic of Hitler and his white supremacy is genocide. He was saying all that stuff. We wanted to desegregate the lunch counter, and then they just tripled the price of the burger. He's telling them all of that. So to me, and I know I've either shared that with you or we've talked about it for years. You just don't remember, and it wasn't written or presented by me as well as it is here. But I'm just saying that part wasn't new per se. It was just, I think, important to see in a monograph, as you're calling it, of this quality. But that point has, anyway.
Let me tell the audience why, as Sherlock Holmes would say, you see but you do not observe. Let me tell you why I didn't know that. I didn't know. See this book, audience? It's called A Testament of Hope. The Essential Writings and Speeches from Martin Luther King. I met the black minister who wrote this book, who edited this book back in 1986, 1987. I thought, in my ignorance, in my sheet, that because I read the biographies and because I read this book, that I thought I knew most of the major speeches. But our leader has mentioned that there are 2 speeches that we are not normally dealing with. And they have nothing to do with street sweepers, right? They have nothing to do with street sweepers.
Street sweepers. Exactly. No,
one of the speeches is called, and I think this is what Dr. Ball is remembering. He does this speech called The Other America.
Yeah.
And that is the speech where he goes, according to our authors here, that's where he goes into, the economic exploitation and capitalism, etc. Now, I bought this book again only for the purpose to compare it to Profit and Discontent. And guess what speech is not in this book?
Wow.
Guess.
Wow.
So even a man who's editing his work and is showing how radical he is from the beginning and all of that, even he leaves it out.
Yeah, no, I don't know to what extent there's an overlap.
Sure.
And it's been a while since I found those documents, but they were, as I remember them, during SCLC's leadership retreats in summers of 66 and 67. King gives these, if not speeches, whatever they were.
Sure.
So if The Other America is a composite or a version or the exact speech, I don't remember, but that was the crux of it. And they're not off. And so I'm the exact opposite. I'm like, I read Where Do We Go From Here? I read those 2 speeches, and I'm like, I'm good. I don't,
right,
you know,
right.
I don't, and then I got this, and I'm like, I'm really good now.
Right.
But I think that so that's why I'm interested in what you're saying is the shortcomings of this book, because I do recognize in talking to you and you know, learning from you all these years, there's a lot to and then reading Garrow as it pertains to Obama, at least, and a little bit of Taylor Branch as it pertains to King. There's value to it. I get the point. I just always want that. I just want that raw, uncut message, that analysis. But anyway, so
well, again,
go ahead.
Critique is almost in quotes. That's why I'm gonna get there. We'll talk about it, because again, there's nothing to disprove in Prophet of Discontent. You know, I do a couple of things that I'm going to get to, but I want to finish out some basic things on King.
Yeah, go ahead.
Into this, since we have the time. At some point,
although we are 90 minutes in already, and you know,
I told y'all what was going to be.
Saying.
Did I tell y'all what was going to happen?
Okay, yeah. Right. Go ahead.
Look, my battery's running out. My cord's over here, so I might have to hold on with the visual. Go to my bed, and I might be just like on my bed talking to you. You know,
my God!
Because I mean, I'm only on page 2 of 6 pages of notes. So I told you. I wrote notes till I got tired. I told you.
All right.
So let me go through some more, because again, I'm sorry, I'm on page 1. Oh wow. Okay. Well, we'll go faster. So, okay. King, in terms of his construction, in terms of even what he says about his intellectual constructions, King never made attempts to find scientific conclusions, but he did make fact-based, societal-based faith acts. Now, why do I point that out? Why was King successful when others were not successful? Well, labor leaders and people like that were not successful. I have to argue because King, as a theologian, whether or not he believed in the symbolism or the literalism of Christianity, he made these open faith acts that people responded to. I'll give you 2 examples of many. I'm in Chicago. He literally went to City Hall and pounded his own version of the theses, you know, of Martin Luther, right? A symbolic act, but he's talking about the poor, poverty, etc., right? But that's a faith act. Christians identify with that act, particularly Protestant Christians. Why? Because Protestantism is protest against the Christian church. But another faith act is that, you know, there was a point in Birmingham where they had run out of money, and King and Abernathy debated over whether to go get arrested. And everybody around Martin said, you can't go do that because we won't have money to get you out, and you know, who knows what will happen without you, and we need you here. And King just quietly went into his bedroom, changed some coveralls, and came out. And Abernathy went and did the same thing. And he said to them, I've got to make a faith act. That, by the way, if you ever see where King and Abernathy, they're kneeled down in prayer and King's eyes are open because he doesn't trust these crackers around him who might kill him, right? Like you rarely see a preacher pray with his eyes open. King was praying with his eyes open because he was scared to death of what was going to happen, right? So even in making the faith act, he's human enough to be afraid. But that's that point where you see him and Abernathy and they're in coveralls and they get arrested. That's that point. King does this kind of thing over and over and over again. And it makes him different because he's not engaging in scientific acts. He's engaging in acts of struggle that he's experimenting to see what the reaction will be. And he's going with both the spiritual development of man and also the spiritual fall of man. And he wants to see if the tension he creates results in the rapture that he clearly wants to happen. And now we're getting very religious now. And the reason I'm pointing out the rapture is because when you read these original articles in Christian Century that are in the Melvin Washington book, many of them written by Stanley Levinson. So once again, as you say, Dr. Ball, our Jewish people write the best Christmas music, right?
Oh, we're going to come back to that and to
right?
Levinson in particular. So,
right. Well, in this case, Levinson was writing the best Christianity articles, right? So King talks about in the Christian Century articles, in the early ones, about how Black people might be the saviors of mankind, and that it may be Black people who have to go through the rapture for everybody else to come out on the other side to heaven, which is what he refers to, using Rock and Butch and Tillett, as a beloved community. King's not talking about a socialist state, although I know the authors want to make the beloved community that. And I get why they want to do that, because it does make sense from a Marxist view. If you're talking about going through a turmoil and coming out with a more equitable society, it makes sense to try to make the beloved community that. But I would argue that the authors are not factoring in the spiritual dimensions of what really motivates King, because what motivates King is not Marx, but Jesus. All right.
Yeah, but you said yourself, and I made a note to come back to this. You said yourself, you don't even know to what extent King actually believed in this or was just following into a profession.
That is
why?
No, that's almost what I said. Let me say exactly what I said. I don't know whether he believes in Christianity symbolically or whether he believes in it literally. Now, if a Christian believes in Christianity literally, they are literally following all the precepts of Christianity. This earth is awash in sin. Your only job is to get saved, so that when you die, Jesus comes and picks you and you go to heaven. That's the literal belief. Because the literal belief is don't even bother with this world. Be in this world, but not of it. Right? King is saying symbolically that, okay, the teachings of Jesus have relevance here, and maybe it's here where we go through the rapture. So, when King's talking about the turmoil, he's not talking about the 3 horses and all of this stuff that's in the book of Revelation. That's very, interesting, and theologians argue about whether this is symbolic or literal or whatever. He's saying, no, all of it is symbolic. All of the book of Revelations is symbolic. But we may be in the book of Revelations now. And to get to heaven, we may have to go through it and come out on the other side. And what's on the other side is the beloved community. Why? Because at that point, so much tension has happened and so much sin has been broken that people then have to reconcile with God for their sin, which is the whole purpose of this Christian witness. Let us remember, and I think it's very important to remember in the 21st century, there is a difference between observation and witness. We kind of conflate the two now, right? So the sister that took the video of George Floyd, right? She was observing it. When she pulled out the camera to take it and she posted it to the world, that was being a witness. That was taking a risk, a physical risk, a social risk, right? King was all about risk. And whatever he believed literally or not, he believed symbolically would work. That's why he tried it. And so everything he did, he was never not a pastor, first of all. In fact, he would leave the movement. He and Abernathy would leave the movement at critical junctures to go and pastor, because they would say, well, it's the first Sunday. And the first Sunday has some sort of spiritual meaning in Baptist tradition that, so like they had to show up that first Sunday. Like they believed in it in terms of the ritual and of the symbolic power of it, right? And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. And so my criticism of this book to get there is that, Okay, now I like saying provocative things, right? Okay, you guys know I love being the leftist equivalent of Stanley Crouch, right? So let me drop one of my leftist Stanley Crouch's things out that Dr. Ball beat me up about, which I'll enjoy. I think the Black left, particularly as exemplified by this book, I think they have a need to see King as a successful version of Walter Rodney, right? That King was somebody who was exposed to movements, learned from movements, tried to implement radical movements, and where Rodney struggled to first get employment and to then get organizations, and he had all of this opposition, and the opposition killed him before he was able to implement some of the things he wanted. King represents like a more successful version of that, where he got to implement desegregation falling. He got to implement Black people and other people getting the right to vote. And then he was going for that final hat trick, which was now we've got to destroy this defense budget and give this defense budget to the poor. Now, had the authors dealt with that, Resurrection City, Abernathy, Jackson, I would have liked this book a lot more. They decided for their own purposes, and I understand how ideologically it fit, to go deal with IBW, but I thought that was a major mistake. Because first of all, there's a great book on IBW. The Challenge of Blackness, the Institute of the Black World and Political Activism in the 1970s, written by Derek White. So we had an analysis of the IBW. What we needed was the authors, and I will say this to them if you let me talk to them. What we needed from the authors was we needed how King's movement, not Strickland's movement, how King's movement continued or not after his death. Resurrection City was literally the continuation of his work. There's no Resurrection City in this book. It's not even mentioned. There's no talk about how Abernathy steers SCLC rightly or wrongly. Abernathy's not even mentioned. There's no mention of Jesse and Jesse creating his own fiefdom off of King, which we have very controversial and complex views on, and which he's trying to deal with the King legacy by first being an adjunct to Abernathy and then breaking from Abernathy. Why? Because Jesse is siding with the Black capitalists in Chicago who say, what are you doing giving all that money to Abernathy? And that's the beginning of the Abernathy-King feud, Abernathy-Jackson feud, and established civil rights leaders Jackson feud that we see pop up in 1984 when Coretta Scott King openly endorses Mondale and the Black crowd boos Coretta Scott King. And Jesse's got to step in and say, no, wait. We don't do that here. Okay? But all of these things that allow ironically, all of these things that would prove the author right in terms of King being at the focal point intellectually of this leftist movement, they leave out. Because what they really want to do is get to IBW and talking about how the King Center rejected IBW. They find that a more interesting story. Why? Because it matches their politics better. Now, here's another thing they leave out.
But wait. You just said Resurrection City and the stuff they didn't cover would actually, had they included it, benefited their argument.
Right.
So then why are you saying they only selected the IBW story to benefit their argument as opposed to saying in other words, because you're making it sound like they picked what was convenient for them when in fact they had much more to choose from. They just didn't do enough. Because you're not saying the IBW analysis that they offer is wrong. It's just insufficient.
No, I'm saying the IBW argument is more in lines of the Cedric Robinson and Marx and all the things they really want to discuss. They don't want to discuss Resurrection City. They don't want to discuss what Abernathy and Jesse believe and what they try to implement and they're not interested in that. They're more interested in the Black radical tradition.
But what they're saying, but what they're saying in that last chapter is that the Institute of the Black World developed in 1970, right? But what I see them doing in this last chapter is saying that because if you only have a short amount of space, it makes more sense to me that of all the evidence you could bring to bear, from SCLC's rightward turn to Jesse's rightward turn, all of which is the point that they're getting at, and I do want us to get to the specifics of what they're saying here. Now I feel like we're getting like BPM Playboy After Dark, where you're like chilling by in the bed. It's like a black Hugh Hefner.
It is Labor Day. Look, I told y'all.
You got your little smoking jacket, your embroidered smoking jacket, and you're just gonna be laid up talking about. I mean, anyway.
There it is. Look, I told y'all I was gonna get comfortable when the battery ran out. So go ahead.
But look, man, if you only have a short amount of space, wouldn't it make more sense to use the IBW story as the summary of what could be said and elaborated on if you had more space in a more but would require more nuance and complication if you're going to start bringing in names of Jesse Jackson, Abernathy, and the SCLC? I mean, I think you make a good point, and I would hope if we get them on, we'll definitely ask about that. But the way you're characterizing it is almost making it sound like what the authors are saying is wrong, when what I hear you really, what it seems would be a more appropriate critique, is that they should have added more to make their accurate argument even stronger.
I agree with everything you said, and I think the authors made a choice, and I think the choice fit what their argument is, and this is why I had to remind myself to go back to the beginning. This is a monograph.
Right. It's not
a monograph.
Right. It's not meant to do, it can't do everything that a full treatment, using your other word, would do.
It's a monograph. And so as a monograph, it's the correct choice for what they are saying. And by the way, I'm sure they would argue if they were here, most books never go from King to the IBW, right? So this book is important, even though I may personally disagree with it as a choice. I understand intellectually it's an excellent choice to make their argument.
But again, when you phrase it that way, you make it sound like they're misrepresenting the IBW, and that if they were to extend their scope to include Abernathy and Jackson and the SCLC, that it would hurt their argument. And that's not, I don't think that that's right. I think, again, okay.
I'm saying they chose the simpler story, and they chose the correct story for what they were trying to say. Not what I want them to say, but what they were trying to say. It's their book. Right?
Right.
It's their argument that they make very well.
But look at what they do by avoiding, again, if you're doing a monograph, by avoiding the Jesse, SCLC, liberal, soft, boring. By doing that, they start off by even reminding us that, as by the way, I have to say, I'm very happy, because of all the flaws with I Mix What I Like, this was actually one of the points that I did not make as well as they're making, but I did attempt to make. That because the whole final chapter essentially is well, it begins at least with the frame of internal colonialism, and reminds us that people like King, Du Bois, Kenneth Clark, and others not only were adherents to that perspective, but have had, in all of those cases, that perspective removed from their work, or themselves later in their life, because they talk about Clark's later work, removing, making a liberalizing, because of the liberal consensus that the authors talk about. To conform to the liberal consensus, either in life you had to walk away from that frame, or you had to be removed in death from that frame, be put to death for the frame, and then removed from the frame after death. Right? Because that's the point. Because by avoiding Jesse and Abernathy, they get to talk about the IBW, internal colonialism, and then put King back in line, literally, with people like Walter Rodney, who becomes a member of the IBW, and puts him back in line with Du Bois and the radical Du Bois. And I actually thought it was interesting that this final chapter starts on Black Study. It's subtitled On Black Study, which is similar or very close to Josh Myers of Black Study, which is making the same point about the reclamation of the radicalism of these people. So my point is, I like what they did here. And then what they end up doing is showing how, whether it's the IBW itself or the King Center, which juxtaposed, they show how the liberal consensus funds what it wants, deprives what it doesn't want, and the IBW collapses. The King Center still exists, but is a rebranding of what King was himself. And then, as we will definitely have to ask Mr. Porter when he comes back, having been the head of the King Center at one point and having been in dialogue with people like Stanley Levinson and others that you know, to the point you made earlier, there has been this whole thing of, I don't want to say too much because I don't have the story right, and I want Porter to break it down. But there is this question of what is the relationship of various groups and people and politics to these Black radical efforts. And this whole thing, you know, the joke we've often made off air about my own background, like sometimes my people do not have my people's best interests at heart. And it's like, and you know, we need to get, you know, so I like that they did it that way. And then we don't have to spend time with what people think they know about Jesse, what people think they know about the famous names of Abernathy and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and all of this. And we can stay focused on internal colonialism, the radical King, these other radical figures like Du Bois and Rodney. And then as they conclude the book, reminding us, as you did, that King was clear about racism, economic exploitation, and militarism that being all tied together. And you can't get rid of one without the other. And then the final sentence is, King's critique belongs to the tradition that shaped it, that carried on after his death, and that continues to reverberate within today's insurgent Black movements. And that's what I liked about how they ended the book, trying to remind, almost speaking to those movements today. You're being encouraged to get a version of Dr. King that isn't real. And if you get the real version of Dr. King, it will actually inspire and push those movements to be more radical and more militant than they are currently. And then that King was himself. And that's what I think is the real value of this book. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's why when I say I critique this book, I'm almost doing it in quotes, because that's critique number one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me get to critique number two. And by the way, it connects with critique number one. Now, the book is called Prophet of Discontent, right? Okay. You know, with these public intellectual books, right? Race Matters, all of that, you know, there's this kind of double meaning, right? The double meaning of the opening phrase. Okay, right. So when I think about this book, I think that they're focusing on discontent, prophet of discontent, right? Whereas I think the emphasis should be on prophet of discontent. Now, why am I saying that? I'm saying that because
you want to take us to church on a Monday.
I'm sorry?
Because you want to take us to church on a Monday.
I take you to church on Monday. We're talking about a preacher. We're talking about a preacher who never stopped being a preacher for one day. The obvious religious aspect, Jesus as the ultimate socialist, with Mahatma Gandhi as an important earthly model of experimentation throughout moderate beginnings and radical endings. Spirit is not just a metaphor for the effects of oppression, not just a dialectic with the reality of lived material conditions. He's not just talking in symbols and strategies. He actually believed these things. The book, says it's tempting to make the theological king into an idealist, not on the ground, but MLK is also in the sky. Now, I don't know what Cornel West does. Maybe Cornel West has a whole book on that. Maybe that's what the Radical King is about. And I get the subtitle. The subtitle is Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. The subtitle is not Martin Luther King, Radical Theologian. I get it. It's a monograph, right? It's a Black Marxist monograph. They start on the ground and they stay on the ground, right? But I just want to point out that, again, there's a reason why Malcolm goes and gets his spirituality correct before coming back here to engage. He doesn't do that for symbolism, although Malcolm, being a master PR person, has some various symbols and publics in mind, and we know that from sophisticated analysis of Malcolm. But when King goes to India at the age of 30, he meets some very hardcore people, where he comes back to America and he starts negotiating with himself over how hardcore he's going to be personally. And that's why no new car, that's why rented house, that's why splitting up the Nobel Peace Prize money. He does things because all the way back to that study he's doing of why he doesn't want to be a preacher, he keeps thinking about how preachers are attracted to money. There were Creflo dollars in King's time too. And he hated those people. That's why he didn't want to be a minister. Because to be a minister was to identify with the Creflo dollars and all. And what's the dude in Texas?
TD Jakes.
TD Jakes.
Yeah, but
right.
And this is maybe.
I'm just pointing out that the reason King is effective is because he's acting in symbolic ways that I believe he believes, and it's not just about a survey of material conditions. He knows the woman, Mother Pollard, in the front row, who was baking the pies and was showing up every day at the rallies in the front row, like that woman in the Apollo that used to show up every day, right, at every Apollo in the front row, right in the center. You know what I'm talking about, right? Mother Pollard, he knows those people. He's ministering to those people, right? So there's another aspect to this that pushes him forward, that I think that this book makes a very passing reference to King as a theologian, and it puts in a couple of books or whatever, and then it moves on because it wants to deal with King's confrontation with the material positions of his people, and wants to deal constantly with the dialectical, because King is trying to synthesize things that have never been attempted, or at least never been attempted in post-World War II America. But I'm just pointing out that those things are missing. So let me give you another criticism of the book, and I put this in quotes, criticism. If King was so leftist, then why didn't he join with Dr. Spock in the 1968 presidential campaign? He was asked very sincerely. Now, for those of you who may not know what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the character on Star Trek. I'm not talking about Leonard Nimoy. I'm talking about Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was a child.
Somebody in your family had the book. I don't, and may still have it. Everybody. I'm talking to everybody.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Somebody in your family had his baby book.
Yeah. Right. Dr. Benjamin Spock, who's a very well-known, famous pediatrician, who becomes a strong leftist, and who the left want to run in 1968, and they want a Spock King ticket. King says no, because now the books written by the liberals say, okay, I'm putting it in there. The books written by the liberals say that he does not want to be associated with being that far left. It's 1968. So that's some problems with what the writers are saying here. But what I think it is to defend the writers, again, see, critique in quotes, to defend the writers, see, King was never involved in somebody else's campaign. He was always involved in his own campaign from the very beginning. And the most famous example of this has to be the Freedom Rods. Snick begged the Lord. That's, they used to call King the Lord derisively, right? They begged the Lord to be involved in the Freedom Rods. And King was like, no, I am not doing that, right? Now, it clearly wasn't dealing with lack of courage on King's part, but it had to do with the fact that King would not have been in control over his own agency if he had gone in the Freedom Rods. He would have had to go along with Snick and what Snick was doing and how they were doing it and what the confrontation would be. King always controlled the confrontation. He understood the nature of the confrontation. He understood all of the variables of the confrontation. So I could see why he wouldn't want to be part of Dr. Spock's ticket, because then he's in control. Then somebody else is controlling his narrative, and King would not be able to do that. So I just wanted to point that out. And again, the fact that that wasn't even mentioned again shows the idea that this is a monograph and the authors are trying to make a very narrow point, which I respect, but I would have respected it, frankly, a little bit more had they at least done a line or a paragraph about that there were certain parts of the left he was not interested in.
But I don't understand if the point of the book of the monograph is to make an argument about King's grappling with racial capitalism, as it's being called today. I don't understand why that campaign would have to be part of the discussion, because first of all, it suggests that a presidential campaign is itself more left than what he was doing. So I think you're making a good point about controlling his confrontation to the extent possible, but but this presupposition that it seems that you're making here that a run with Spock would have been more left than what he was doing or advocating I'm not there. I'm not on that one.
My argument is his engagement with that. If the authors had showed his engagement with that, we would have seen some sort of tension, political tension. And the author's book is about political tension, right? It's about him going past the civil rights leader into a new level of tension. So I would have liked to have seen him grapple with the larger questions of the larger white left, or back then as it was called, the new left, right? That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
All right, so let me see. Let me go through some other notes. Okay, I talked about the Vincent Harding turn at the end. I say here the book wants to be trapped in Cedric Robinson's Rubik's Cube. And I talk about, again, the failure to merge black theology with the left movement. Could have been explained more, but you wanted to say something.
Well, I'm just saying, what is the issue with Robinson's Rubik's Cube? Like, what is...
Well, I think because it's a monograph and it says up front what it is. We are looking at King through the eyes of Cedric Robinson's critique of racial capitalism and through Marx. I'm saying because it wants to stay there, it stays there. And again, that may be an unfair criticism. If it is, I'll accept it as one. But it's just what I was thinking of when I was reading, and I was like, okay, you're sticking so close to the margins. I'm not getting the other things that would show even King's discomfort with that.
With his discomfort with the marginal arguments?
His discomfort with both the radical left as exemplified by the new left, and his radical discomfort with the patron saint of the new black left, a man by the name of France, who's also not mentioned in this book. I guess enough time has passed, enough people have died. So this Mary Magdalene, so who was King's Mary Magdalene, right? His sexual Mary Magdalene, that has been ID'd as Dorothy Cotton, right? And that was a little shocking to me because I've met Dorothy Cotton. I've been at a King program with Dorothy Cotton at Seton Hall, so that was a little shocking to me, right? But trust
me, you've met plenty of people who have had flings with plenty of people, whether you've been aware of it or not, right, in and out of the movement. So right, I mean,
right.
So again,
this is the new information, and this new information, I want to take one of Dr. Ball's. That was a Freudian. I want to take one of Dr. Ball's sticks and point out who's on the back cover as the blurbs. Let's take a look. Do you want me to do it?
Yes.
Ken Burns, David Garrow, Gene Theosis, who's the theologian and activist who's done some books on the movement.
Oh my God.
And your favorite historian, Dr. Ball, Peniel.
No, they didn't. They hit us with the penny trick. Are you serious?
Hit us with the penny trick.
Oh my God, that's even better than I realized. This is perfect.
All right, so
okay, no, wait, don't say another word, because
go right ahead.
That is perfect as a segue to my review, which
go right ahead
for those, because
I'm now done. I'm now done.
Well, this is it. That's it, and it's perfect because this is exactly what Peniel does to Kwame Ture in Stokely: A Life. So it's perfect. So we get King: A Life and Stokely: A Life, written by Peniel Joseph. Both do the exact same thing. Both have the exact same political perspective. Both do the exact same erasing of the context of the state's oppression. And this book may be even the most slick version of that I've ever seen. Because as I made a note here, you get in Eag's book, you get all kinds of discussion of J. Edgar Hoover and even reference to William Sullivan. And they don't mention one word of the counterintelligence program. So you can perfectly, fraudulently, and that has to be an intentional omission. And the reason he does it is the exact same reason that Peniel does it to Kwame Ture in Stokely: A Life, which is the minute you reference or put any real focus on the counterintelligence program, you immediately radicalize and internationalize the person who was the subject, and you immediately change the context that is the purpose of these false narratives in the first place, which is to situate the United States as still some beacon of unique freedom in the world, in the universe, that is only parenthetically interrupted by moments of colonization, enslavement, abuse, rape, pillaging, etc., and so forth. So, and then just like our dear friend Don King, they can say only in America, and do as he starts off the book. On December 5th, 1955, a young black man became one of America's founding fathers.
The fuck is he talking about?
So a man that was among this country's most staunch and prolific critics, that this country sanctioned and participated in his assassination, is now recast as a founding father, just as you pointed out was done in this tradition of these kinds of biographies.
Ing's first sentence is Branch's last paragraph.
So I just want to say again, most importantly, because this is what's ultimately most important here that makes what I like, is that I was right about the Peniel penny trick going back now more than a decade in calling this dude out. And when people were saying, Jared, you're doing too much. Jared, why are you focused on this guy? My whole point even then was to say, because he is going to be a generational problem. His co-signing, his presence is going to be a permanent generational problem that, to your point, and I love the way you did it, he's talking to the 15-year-olds. They're not talking to us. They know we know better. They know they can't run this nonsense on us. That's why you send 17-year-olds to war. Because once you hit 25 and older, I'm not getting shot up for this nonsense. Once you become 25 and older, as a parallel intellectually to an understanding of this history, you're not going for this nonsense. So that, and it was already asked as a, thank you, Virgo Life, for your super chat, but I meant to raise this anyway. This is a perfect question. What does he say about the tapes? I'm gonna pull this up for you real quick.
I see it. I'm gonna give you the answer. The answer is,
but well, go ahead and give your answer.
The answer is, when these tapes come out, I think in either 2027 or 2037, I forget the date, there'll be another biography on King.
No. Look at what he does here, Todd.
Go ahead.
Look at how he ends the book, because this is how I read these books. I know, especially when I'm not doing a real critique like when we did with Marable. And I read the intro and I read the outro, and then as much time permits, I get into the middle of it. And you can see just in that what they're going to do. You see how they frame the book. And look at what he does right here. Look at what he does right here. 35 years later, when the FBI released thousands of pages from its secret files on King, no evidence emerged to suggest that communist operatives controlled or manipulated King. The documents did offer new details on his extramarital affairs, as well as on the emotional strain he endured. The biggest revelation contained in the FBI reports, however, may have been the extent and determination of the Bureau's campaign to thwart King and the degree to which the campaign was fueled by the personal obsessions of J. Edgar Hoover and President Johnson. This is some skillful and artful, complete and total fraudulent nonsense. And it is this kind of slickness that does, I admit, infuriate me, because what they're doing here, and this is exactly what they did in the Judas and the Black Messiah film regarding Fred Hampton, they will acknowledge something. It's too big to omit.
Right.
But they contextualize it as a thing of Hoover and President Johnson, not of the state, not of a counterintelligence program, which again goes unmentioned. Right. Not of the need of empire to destroy internal threats, as he wildly did. And with all due respect, and for all the pettiness of self-promotion, my now near 20, because I was still at Maryland at the PhD program, my now 20+ year presentation on what the Washington Post did to Dr. King, destroys what this man does in his thousands of pages and hours of research in discussing the media critique of King. Because the point is, even as he acknowledges the press hated on King, he does so outside of the context of their doing it because of his critique of imperialism, capitalism, his threat to the national security of the state, the direction pointed at the state's support, if not participation in his assassination. They're near calling for it 90 days within in the Washington Post, and before he's killed, calling him a threat to national security. His march is going to be taken over by the Leninists and Stokely Carmichael's victory of the power. This is them saying this dude is but he doesn't do that in here.
But let me say why. But let me say why, and let me give
the why though is because this is something, and I just want to this. I'll stop here with this. But I do this real quick. Yeah. The why, though, is because this man is an unqualified, well-platformed, promoted spokesperson for the history that this country wants to rebrand.
Because he also does the history of Ali. Right.
He does Ali. He's a sports journalist. He's on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He writes articles for Men's Health.
Right.
This is not, he writes books about Lou Gehrig.
Right.
This is not somebody who understands Black history, African world history. He has not demonstrated any recognition of radical history or the movements that inspired King, that were moving King. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand communism or socialism or pan-africanism. Or at least he doesn't demonstrate any of that. So he's perfect for this, as was Peniel Joseph to become the founding father of Black Power studies and all this other nonsense that he self-proclaimed at one point. Also that we get the 15-year-olds who pick up King, and because as you pointed out, this is about 20 years, 17, 20 years later, a new generation might wake up and say, hold up. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.